Well, good morning and welcome to the YouTube version of the sermon for the 14th of June for Whitley Lodge Baptist Church, and indeed anybody else who has time and interest enough to listen in. I'm doing today the second in a series of three, which is based on what will the post-coronavirus church look like, or perhaps what should the post-coronavirus church look like as we gradually come through, well, hopefully come through this pandemic, and we return to something that we may come to call normal or normalish. What will change? What should the church look like in terms of what we have learned? And so last week was the introduction to this, and I want to think today about fellowship. And because in terms of Whitley Lodge, this is tied into a communion service, so the message has that kind of a flavour. So if you are not able to join us for communion, please understand that at least is part of the context. So I'm going to look at just a couple of passages that will inform thinking. And the first one is one that we used last week, and it's from Acts chapter 2, verse 42. After the 3,000 people responded to Peter's message, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to prayer. Everyone was filled with awe at the many wonders and signs performed by the apostles. All the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. They met every day. They continued to meet together in the temple courts. They broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts, praising God and enjoying the favour of all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. And then moving on to 1 Corinthians, or if by any chance you're listening to this from the other side of what we call the pond, 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? And is not the bread which we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we all partake of the one loaf. And so today I want to look at the joint concepts of fellowship and breaking of bread. And I want to begin by saying this. The way we do communion, the way we celebrate what we call communion, needs to change. Now, I say that from the perspective of a Baptist background, where we sit in our seats and we wait for often little cubes of bread or a chunk of bread from which we take a pinch maybe to come round, and we are served where we sit, and then we have these tiny little individual cups of non-alcoholic wine which we all kind of drink together. And I'm going to suggest that the way we do communion needs to change. It needs to change because it is very individual. It is very remote. We're each doing it in our own little isolated compartment. And it is actually rather British, although I know many other parts of the world do it in the same way. I wonder where they got it from. The early church, the church which was established at Pentecost, which was following the command of Jesus to make disciples, which is what we looked at last week, they didn't hold communion services. They didn't do communion. What they did was they shared their lives. They shared their homes. They shared their tables. And in the context of sharing their homes, their lives, their tables, in that context, they broke bread. And the term breaking bread means a lot more than what we mean by holding a communion service. It wasn't very professional. In fact, one of the things that I believe actually quite passionately is that the professionally led communion service, Eucharist, Mass, whatever it is, in whatever tradition you come from, the professionally led communion Eucharist service has as much to do with the breaking of bread in the early church as chopsticks has to do with playing the piano. You know, chopsticks, the tune that kids play on the piano. It has as much to do with breaking of bread as chopsticks has to do with playing the piano, or Lego bricks have to do with building a house. Or, if I may be really crude and adventurous, it has as much to do with breaking of bread as pornography has to do with love. Breaking of bread was an expression of what's called koinonia. Now, in Acts chapter 2, 42 onwards, each of these words, each of these nouns has the definite article. So if we were to translate it literally, Acts 2:42 would read, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship and to the breaking of bread and to the prayer. They all have the definite article. It's as if they're identifying something which was a key component of the life of the church in the very early days. Now, why is this important? It isn't important because we have to copy the early church. Jesus left no blueprint for the church, but Jesus did give instructions to make disciples, and the way, what they did following the day of Pentecost was they followed their understanding of what Jesus meant by making disciples. And there were these four key elements: the teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, the prayer. And I want to focus today really on the middle two, because the key, in a way, the key word in this is koinonia, which is the word which we translate fellowship. It's a very rich word. It describes the relationship which Jesus had with the disciples, and it describes the relationship that we should have with one another. New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, which is one of my favourite resources, puts it this way: it arose out of the untrammelled freedom from care. Sorry, I'll say that again. It arose out of the untrammelled freedom from care that Jesus preached, and from his lofty scorn of goods. It was an expression of their life together and their life free of encumbrances. Now, it isn't the case. Some people say, well, what the early church did, they formed a commune or a community. They sold what they had and they all lived together. Well, no, they didn't, because whilst some people clearly did sell things and give money, particularly in chapter 4, Barnabas sold a field and gave them money. Understand the context. Pentecost had happened when all these people from lots of different parts of the world had all descended on Jerusalem. They left their homes far behind. They descended on Jerusalem, and there they had been transfixed and transformed by the message of Jesus. They didn't want to go home, at least not for a while. They wanted to stay where they were. Perhaps it wasn't till the persecution that arose after the stoning of Stephen that they were scattered back to where they came from. And there was a major logistical problem. How do we care for all these people? Well, they cared by sharing what they had. They had everything in common, verse 44. They sold property and possessions and gave to everyone who had need, verse 45. And that is how they lived. But they broke bread in their homes. So people didn't sell up their homes. It was a kind of mixed economy where They did what they had to do to make sure that everyone's needs were met, so that this brand new, sparkling, spanking new church could take off and be the entity that Jesus had in mind for it. Again, quoting from the New International Dictionary of New Testament Theology, the word koinonia denotes the unanimity and unity brought about by the Spirit. The individual was completely upheld by the community. And if you want a definition of how koinonia should work, I love that. The individual was completely upheld by the community. It didn't deny individual responsibility. It didn't deny the individual ownership of property, but it did mean that each individual was upheld by the family of the community. And I think that's a wonderful model for us to use. And so we think about communion today. And we think about the words of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, where Paul talks about the bread and the wine of communion. And Paul uses words not about taking communion, but he talks about a participation in the blood of Christ, a participation in the body of Christ. In other words, the church. What communion should be, it is an expression of our fellowship. It should be a symbolic representation of how we live as a church community. And that's why it has to change. Maybe we carry on having bits of bread and wine, but it needs to become an expression of our life together. See, one of the things I passionately believe was that, you see, in the New Testament, they didn't have communion services. What they did, they went to each other's homes and they ate together. They shared together. They were very excited. They listened. They were taught. They prayed. The apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, which was really more to do with sharing a meal, and the prayers. And they were participating in the body and the blood of Christ. And in the context of sharing, breaking bread in each other's homes, which verse 46 refers to, they broke bread in their homes and ate together with glad and sincere hearts. And in the context of that meal, somebody, and it probably wouldn't have to be an apostle or anybody in particular, somebody would take a chunk of bread and would say, let's remember the Lord's death. And the bread would be broken. And they would share the bread. And then a cup of wine would be poured, which would be passed around. Let's remember the blood of Christ. And it would all happen in the context of the fellowship, the breaking of bread, the prayers, and the teaching of the apostles. No, I'm not necessarily suggesting that we return to celebrating the Lord's Supper in that kind of way. But if the Lord's Supper is not an expression of our koinonia, then it is not really an authentic expression of communion. So what is the post-coronavirus church going to look like? Well, one of the things that I think that will need to change is our understanding of koinonia, of fellowship. I'm going to suggest that there are three things that we need to focus on for this to be the case. One, koinonia needs to be based on authenticity of character and expression of faith. It needs to be real and genuine. We need to dispense with the artificiality that is so much a part of so much of church life, where we come together and we meet and we do our thing, and maybe we have communion and we go away. And sometimes we're not kind, and sometimes we're not generous with each other. And sometimes we only allow people to see the small part of us that is on show on a Sunday or at any other time. We must develop a koinonia that is authentic. The Northumbria community expresses it this way. It says that our fellowship will be expressed by availability and vulnerability, which means that I will be there for you. I will be available for you. And in being available for you, I will be genuine. I will be vulnerable. I will let you in. And this happens in the context of all that we do together. I once knew a chap at a church where I kind of looked after the church while it was without a minister for a little while. And we had a church meal, and one of the significant figures in the church was very kind and offered to prepare the meal for the rest of the church. It was really kind of him and his wife. But when we came to actually eat the meal, he didn't appear and his wife didn't appear. And I mentioned this to one or two people, and they said, oh no, he never eats with us. He'll cook and he'll prepare, but he won't come and eat with us. And what I sort of worked out as I got to know this chap a bit was that he only wanted to engage with the fellowship of the church to the very outward shell of his being. You are not going to get inside my head and inside my heart. I'm not going to be vulnerable with you. I won't be exposed to you. I'm only going to let you look at the shell. And so much of what we do is like this. We see the shell. We let people see the shell, but we don't let people see the genuine inside. There are all sorts of reasons for that. One of them is that we're afraid of being hurt. We're afraid because if I let you into my vulnerable places, you can hurt me. If I keep you outside, you can't. And trust me, there is risk in this. If you really let people into the core of your life, if you are vulnerable, there are risks. There are risks that people will abuse it. They will take your vulnerability and they will exploit it for their own ends. You can get hurt. You can feel embarrassed because you are probably, as so many Christians are, labouring under the apprehension that I'm the only one with this problem. And the reason you think you're the only one with this problem is because nobody else talks about it either. You're not. I once got into a group of men where we started being vulnerable with each other, and we started talking about our temptations in relation to members of the opposite sex who are rather attractive. And we all discovered we had precisely the same struggles with it. And actually, it's incredibly normal that we do. But until that point, none of us have been prepared to say so. You know, it's dangerous. Oh, but it's so rewarding. Because within that comes a knitting together of the body of Christ. And with that comes the capacity for us to encourage and help each other along, and to help us to overcome our demons, our difficulties, our temptations, our hang-ups, our doubts, our fears, and so on. But it won't happen if we only get to see the shell. So we need to be available to one another, but not simply available, not simply say, oh yes, I can give you a lift to the doctor or the hospital, which is a wonderful thing to do, but I will also let you into my life and I'll be vulnerable for you there. Number 2, hospitality. They were always in and out of each other's homes. The early church, this koinonia, the common currency of koinonia was that they shared their homes, they shared their meals, they shared their tables, they shared their lives. Part of the expression of vulnerability was letting people in to the physical reality of their lives. It should be that certainly every week we have fellow Christians coming to our house to share with us. We should expect the whole business of hospitality to be commonplace. We should constantly be sharing time together, meals together. It's nice to be invited out for a meal, but actually it's a lot more intimate. It's a lot better expression of fellowship, not to take somebody out for a meal, but to say, come to my home, let me cook for you, let's eat together. And I want to move on, because I want this to be a relatively short message. So, authenticity, expressed in availability and vulnerability, hospitality, sharing the substance of our life, and then thirdly, generosity. The term koinonia has the connotation of being generous. In 1 Timothy 6 and verse 18, Paul says to Timothy, command them to be good, to be rich in deeds, and to be generous and willing to share. And the word generous is koinonikos, which is an extension of koinonia. And the word koinonia has within it the overtone of generosity. And by generosity, I don't really mean putting another £5 or another £10 or another £20 in the collection plate or increasing your direct debit, much as that is welcome. And I'm sure any church treasurer watching will be more than happy to accommodate such generosity. That isn't particularly what I mean. Koinonia in terms of generosity is about cultivating an attitude that says, your need is my need, and I will try to meet it. And that need may be material and may be financial, but it may well not be. In fact, it's far more likely to be something else. It is actually relatively easy to throw some money at somebody to solve a practical problem. That is actually quite a cheap form of generosity. But generosity goes much, much further. The post-coronavirus church needs to be characterized by a fellowship that is generous. And I'm talking about heart generosity. What do I mean by heart generosity? I mean being non-judgmental and accepting. You may not do things or see things or believe things or practice things or understand things the way I do, but I will accept you. Your lifestyle may not be one that I identify with. In fact, it may be one that I find it difficult to accommodate in some respects, but I will respect and I will accept you. It doesn't mean to say that I will approve of everything you do, but I will accept you. I will have a generosity of heart. I will seek to be non-judgmental, because I may not know what you are going through. One of the things that you learn as you go on, particularly in ministry, is that you learn that the sort of people that you once kind of judged because of their lifestyle probably, almost certainly, have a story, a history. Somebody I know who is a chronic alcoholic with all sorts of other problems told me her life story. And I thought, well, if that had been me, if all the things that had happened to you had happened to me, I simply wouldn't be here. I'd have killed myself, I think, before now. The fact that you survived and you are here is incredible. So much of the time we don't know what people's story is. We don't know their history. We don't know what's going on behind closed doors, partly because of our paucity of fellowship. And it's really important in this whole business of making disciples and having fellowship. It is really important that we cultivate a non-judgmental and accepting attitude, an attitude that believes the best, an attitude that wishes the best, that wishes good things, God's blessing in every possible way upon the people we meet and the people we know as fellow Christians. Yeah, ministers have a real problem with this. We celebrate each other's successes through gritted teeth if we're not enjoying the same success. There's no place for that in the koinonia of the gospel. The koinonia of the gospel says it's fantastic that good things are happening for you. They're not happening for me, but I'm really pleased they're happening for you. And I'm really glad they're happening for you. A generosity of heart, which is non-judgmental, which is accepting, which is believing the best, hoping for the best, wishing for the best, all those 1 Corinthians 13 things. A generosity with money, being prepared to share what we have in our bank balance, being generous with our possessions. Do I actually need this when somebody else has greater need of it? It's a lovely VeggieTales cartoon about a vegetable that is a tomato, and he has a hairbrush, and somebody borrows his hairbrush, and he has to come to terms with someone borrowing his hairbrush, and he realizes in the end, well, actually, I don't need a hairbrush, but you do because you're a hairy vegetable. And so he lets go of his hairbrush. A generosity with what we own that says, you need this more than I do, or we can share this. A generosity of money and possessions, and a generosity of spirit. How do I sum all of this up? What I long for in terms of fellowship for the church, what I long for is an end to box mentality. What I mean by that is that we tend to live our lives as Christians in boxes. We live in a box. We get into a box with wheels. We drive to church. We go into another box, and that's our church box. And then we go back into our box with wheels and back into our box with our bed in. And we may occasionally move from one box to another box to meet some Christians. It'd be great if we could take all these walls down and learn what it is to share our lives together in a spirit of availability, vulnerability, hospitality, and generosity. So those are the things I want to leave with you. The sharing, a fellowship, a koinonia that is real. And by real, I mean we are available and we are vulnerable. A fellowship that is generous, a fellowship that is hospitable. And I believe that is the kind of koinonia that the post-coronavirus church will need if it is really to be authentic and to meet the needs of those who we are trying to encourage to become disciples of Jesus. Thanks for listening. See you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.